So this is a soft Aka pin. So it's one of the softer finishers that you can get, you know, on the coarser side. But what I'll do is I'll cross hatch, and I do this with all the stones, cross mark, right? And you're probably familiar with this just from sharpening. Just make sure that you want your stone as flat as possible. And then I'll use a 400 grit Atoma flattening plate, and just go through and make sure that the whole thing is flat as possible. And I only use this plate, this 400 grit, for on naturals. I don't use it on synthetics. I kind of want to avoid that cross-contamination. And you can see how creamy this stone is, just based on having flattened it. You can see that it really works up quite a bit of mud. So you can tell it's on the soft side. So I'm just gonna, and then I'm gonna work the edges as well, because I don't want those to, that's a lot of scratches will come from having the edges raised slightly. So a lot of polishers you'll see, you know, good polishers like Ivan and the best, they'll make sure that it actually curves down a little bit right here, so that you don't have, because this is a really easy place to scratch your knife. The cladding is from these little corners right here. So you'll kind of work those at an angle, make sure that it's all nice and rounded. So I'll kind of work that the best I can. There you go. Make sure they're all rounded. There you go. And then I like to give it a good scrub. Just make, you know, I'll use my sponge to scrub the stone, just to make sure there's no cross-contamination, just because I was working with the coarse stone just seconds ago, and I want to make sure there's no 200 grit, you know, particulate kind of getting in the way here. And then at this point you can choose, you know, what do you want your starting point to be? Do you want to just use the stone as is, or do you want to start with some slurry? And so, you know, soft stone like this, you could just potentially just start, you know, with no slurry, or you could use slurry to, you know, to help fill in some of the gaps. But I'm going to be using this Nakiri from Yannick to do a little bit of polishing, and the bevels aren't 100% like perfect for a fine level, for a super fine finishing stone. So that's why I use this one to, you know, a softer stone, just to kind of illustrate the example. Because I have used this with some of the softer stones. And so what I'll do is I'll just kind of make sure nice and steady movements, targeting each part of the bevel that I want to polish, right? And what I'm also doing is getting feedback from the stone, where I'm making sure that it's not skidding. If it's skidding, that means that you're burnishing, right? That means you're applying too much pressure, or the bevel isn't clean, right? And it's just not a good match for the stone. So this one's already generating quite a bit of mud from the get-go, and you can see, like, okay, hey, it's already starting to get a little, you know, it's already starting to bring out some of that detail right there. So it's starting to look pretty good, right? But, you know, just to illustrate the example, what I could do is say, hey, do you know what? And this is what you probably want to do with some of those finer stones, is start with a slurry. So much of polishing is making sure that the stone is prepped appropriately, right? So if I start with some mud now, you know, it's going to be able to, if the bevels aren't 100% clean, it's going to help fill in some of those gaps, right? And then I can add a little bit of water to that because it looks a little thick. Right there. And now let's give this a shot. And you can do a combination of methods. You could use no slurry for the core steel, right? And then have a slurry for the cladding, right? So it's like, okay, you want to brighten up the core steel as much as possible, so no slurry, and then use a slurry to work the cladding. And typically the cladding and the shinogi line is where, you know, the bevel tends to have the most unevenness, right? So in this case, the bevel, it's easy to polish a low bevel like this because there isn't a lot that you have to polish, right? Versus the full convex that you're trying to polish. So I just kind of work my way okay, I know that I'm getting the top right here with the finger placement, then I'll slowly move my fingers down and get the bottom, and I know that they're overlapping, right? And then I'm using these fingers to also kind of apply a little bit of pressure to make sure that it's making full contact on those areas, right? And then you can see that it's starting to build up some of that black slurry, right? And let's get a little spritz on here. So even for a coarse stone, I like that. You know, it's doing a pretty good job of bringing out that detail. So, and then with these softer stones, you can go a little faster. On the hard, super fine stones, you got to be very careful. I'm moving very slowly and very cautiously on those really fine stones, because one false stroke and you can burnish the cladding, and then it's kind of a pain to fix, right? So, you know, you have hours of work on the line, so I tend to go very slow on those. And you'll notice as you work a stone, the feedback will start to be different, because you're working through the part of the stone that has already been kind of softened up by the flattening plate. And you'll notice it starts to get stickier. So what you want to do is, okay, now that I've worked it and it's starting to get sticky and I feel like it might burnish soon, I'll rub this down again with a flattening plate to kind of soften it up a bit, to make sure that it doesn't burnish. And that happens especially fast with these finer finishing stones. So you may want to, you know, refinish or recondition the stone much more often. The finer and the harder the stone gets, right? But using a stone like this it still has a great finish, bringing out a lot of detail, right? The cladding could pop a little bit more, right? So maybe this isn't a place that you want to stop at. I just don't know if I'm getting the visual on here, but you can see that that's pretty respectable. With this for a softer stone. So I'm trying to see if I get the light right on this. But it also filled in a lot of the gaps, because this shinogi isn't perfect, but because it's soft, it did a pretty good job of filling in those gaps. I tried this with an Uchigomori recently, and I had some issues. It was a harder one, and I had some issues along this line that need to be cleaned up with synthetics. So, but yeah, this is I like to, you know, this is kind of my finger placement. You know, I use these two to orient, you know, on these axes. I use this for the control, nice, firm, and steady, right? When I'm polishing, I typically like the orientation to almost be parallel to the shinogi. But one of the reasons why I showed this knife initially was because as you set the scratch pattern, you start to get a feel for how to best polish each section, right? Closer to the shinogi, further away. You get a feel for the convexity. So actually, you know, setting your own geometry, by the time you get to polishing, you know the bevel really well. So it's actually easier for me to polish a knife that I've set the geometry on, and I know how I've put the scratch pattern in. You'll notice this scratch pattern, right, is like this. As I get further and further to the, you know, along the progression, the scratch pattern will become almost parallel, because that's how I want the finish to be. But in between, what I'll do is I'll alternate. I'll have this direction, and then I'll also go this direction to help blend the bevel, so that you don't end up with streaks, right? And that's with a full convex. You know, I don't know necessarily if Marion had done, you know, if he just had kind of one direction that he just kind of worked through, or did he actually switch directions to make sure that he was, you know, working out maybe any kind of spots that were hidden along this orientation. If you only work one pattern, it's really hard to tell if you're getting everything. So I kind of follow I'll set it this way, and then I'll also alternate, and I'll go perpendicular to the shinogi and the edge to help blend it. And it takes longer, but by the end, you have a really well set bevel that makes polishing a pleasure, right? So yeah, that's kind of, hopefully that helps, you know, using these two fingers, having it nice and flat and firm, right? You want to be able, when you put it down, you want to be able to say, okay, I know where I've set my pressure. I know the direction I'm going to push my stroke, right? And I'm going to work this area. Like, okay, so right now I'm working this one particular area, and I'm going to work that. And then I'm going to come back and look for feedback almost immediately and say, okay, did I get this area that I was working, right? And get that. A lot of times when you start out, you're kind of like, okay, I'm just going to work it, and hopefully when I turn it over, it looks great. But I think most people do this, is that they'll work an area, maybe 20 seconds, and then say, okay, let me take a look and evaluate what I'm doing, right? Am I getting any odd scratches? Is there any particulate in here that's messing things up? Is there an area that I've missed, right? So all those things, you want that feedback as soon as possible. You don't want to wait to the very end. Hopefully this is helpful. I'm honest, I'm not a professional. I'm nowhere close to Ed Thompson and some of these other guys who publish their work all the time. So this is the best I think I can offer you at the moment, but hopefully this helps.